Well, welcome everybody. My name is John Atkinson. I'm the editor of this magazine here, Stereophile. Hope you're all readers. Anyone here not a reader? We're giving them away on a proof downstairs. And the title of this talk was originally going to be "There is no absolute sound." Now, the organisers of the show pointed out that although I'm talking about in the recording context, that might be taken in a different way in my lesson. So there is an absolute sound, but I'm going to be talking about a different kind of absolute sound. I have one such here. At great expense, I have brought the cowbell. Now, everything goes better with more cowbell, you know that. So, this is what a cowbell sounds like. If I move over to your right, now the sound reaching your ears from a cowbell is louder in your right ear than your left ear. It also reaches your right ear before it reaches your left ear. Similarly, if I move off axis to the left. Human beings detect direction of sound sources by using both those amplitude differences between the two ears and the timing difference between the two ears. Above 2 kilohertz or so, the brain goes, it's louder that side, the sound source must be over there. Below 800 hertz, it goes, the sound reaches this ear before that ear, it must be over there. And the two mechanisms combined give you very good directional acuity. I mean, think about it. If it didn't work well, you would have been eaten by a saber-toothed tiger and would have had children because you wouldn't have heard where it was coming from. So, here's the real thing. And I'll now play you, out of the left channel, a recording I made in my backyard. Okay? Absolutely trivial. Everybody is familiar with the idea of you put a microphone up and capture a sound. Here it is out of a right channel. I know this is unbelievably simple. Why am I wasting your time talking about this? Well, real thing, recording out of one speaker or one speaker. There's no conceptual difference. In both cases, your ear and your brain are working together to say there's something exactly there, or here, or here, or there. But if I play that recording through two speakers simultaneously, you hear a cowbell in the center. This is so familiar, we don't think about it. Stop. You don't think about it. But actually, we've moved into a completely different realm of perception. With the real thing, with the mono recording, you're hearing something that is real. Once you move into stereo, where you play different signals or the same signals in two speakers, you're moving into the world of perception, an illusion, and nothing is real. But there is no cowbell here. There is just one cowbell there and one cowbell there. And your brain goes, I can't make sense of this. Well, the only way I can make sense of it is if there were a cowbell in the center. But it's an illusion. It cannot be measured. When you read in some of the objectivist magazines that, well, these audiophiles, they go on about sound staging and depth of image, and we're just talking, it's all in their heads. But you have to remember what Professor Dumbledore said to Harry Potter in the final Harry Potter movie. Harry Potter, young man, just the fact that it's all in your head doesn't mean it isn't real. And so with stereo, it's an illusion, and what I'm going to be talking about in the next 25 minutes or so is how the way the recordings are made affect the quality of that illusion. Because as audiophiles, it's the quality that matters to us of the illusion. It can't be measured, but it's absolutely real to each of us as a listener. So, just a few basics. If I change the level of the cowbell in the two channels, you can actually place the cowbell anywhere you like in that soundstage. Come on, computer. When it's in maximum level in the left, minimum in the right, you get an image in the left, and vice versa. Also, remember I talked about the human ear and brain uses time information to create an image? What I did now was, instead of using amplitude to pan the image from side to side, I used the time difference to pan the image from side to side. Computer's beating me today. So with that, with amplitude stereo, which is what almost all recordings are made with, you get very accurate soundstage representation, depending on the amplitude ratio between the channels. With time stereo, you actually, although you can get images to the left and right, it's all very unstable in the center, because your ear and brain is not used to just hearing time information. And in fact, I'll play you a recording I made some years ago, which is a time stereo recording of a piano. It's not amplitude stereo. I use spaced omni microphones. It still is, it's kind of stereo, but listen to this. It's about 2 minutes long, and about 1 minute in, I make a catastrophic change, which I'll be interested to see if you hear. Did anybody get anything change about a minute in? Really? What I did, I flipped the polarity of just one channel. And with a time stereo recording, it doesn't matter. There's so little correlation between the two channels that the normal, you're so familiar with it, you've got to have your speakers in phase. Otherwise you get thin sound and no bass. With a time stereo recording, it doesn't actually matter. So I'm going to make a recording of the absolute sound of music in a real acoustic space. I now have a question. Do I make it with amplitude stereo miking or time stereo miking? My next example I'll play you, it's the Minnesotan Male Voice Choir Counters. They're performing a work by Chicago composer Maura Bosch. I recorded it with nearly coincident cardioid mics, which give me a good amplitude stereo recording. I recorded it with spaced omnis, like I did the piano, to give me a time stereo recording. And I also recorded it with omnis each side of a baffle, which is what Ray Kimber does with his isomic technique, which is supposed to give you a bit of the best of both. So I'll play you first the cardioid mic recording. Excuse me. I good stereo, but it's close and clear, maybe too clear, doesn't give you a good sense of the ambience. So this is the Space Omni version. Exactly the same performance, but Space Omnis rather than coincident cardioids. I have a I have been China. Exactly where the singers are compared to the cardioids, but you get a lovely sense of the whole, and there's the bloom to the sound which the cardioids didn't capture at all. The third recording is with the omnis either side of the baffle. Will be. Capturing the whole, much less good at capturing the singers. Because the mics are quite close together and the baffle is relatively small, it's a mono recording at low frequencies. But which of those is the absolute sound? I mean, the mics are almost in the same position. The singers are obviously in the same position, the same performance, but those recordings are so different from one another, which is the one which a reviewer could use as reference to the absolute sound of acoustic music in outer space. Now, the recordings I made are for commercial release, and not one of these really represents what you hear, I heard in the hall, in the good seat, traditional good seat. So, for the release, I mixed those three recordings. The cardioids, I added a little bit of bass EQ, because cardioids roll off the lows if they're a long way away from the source. For Space Omnis, remember I said the human ear and brain doesn't use time information in the top octaves, so I gently rolled off the highs on the Space Omnis. I mixed in a little bit of the Omnis on the Jekyllin disc to give me a better sense of the whole, which was what I heard in real life. So I'm going to play you the final mix, but the point I'm making is, what you're hearing, even though there's a real event in absolute sound in real space, nevertheless, I have used a lot of artifice, a lot of art, to produce my opinion of what the real thing should have sounded like. By the way, the lyrics, if you're wondering, they're a bit unusual. Maura, she sent a questionnaire to prisoners in Chicago, men who'd been convicted of beating their wives, abusing their wives. And the lyrics are their answers on the questionnaire, which she rearranged as a narrative. choice of how to use my microphones has a huge effect on what is captured in the pits or in the bits or in the grooves. But what about the microphones themselves? This is a recording I made 20 years ago with the late J. Gordon Holt. I recorded Gordon reading an essay from an early issue of Stereophile, and I used, I think if I remember correctly, 12 different microphones. And every time he reaches the end of a sentence, I splice into a new microphone. Listen to how they change the sound of Gordon's voice.
Why Hi-Fi Experts Disagree, by me, J. Gordon Holt. From Stereophile, Volume 1, Issue 4, dated March-April 1963. The high-fidelity initiate, bewitched, bothered, and thoroughly confused by the staggering selection of components he must choose from, often turns to a high-fidelity expert to assist him in assembling his dream system. The expert may be a local consultant, a dealer, or a magazine that the prospective buyer trusts as a source of accurate, down-to-ear information. If this seeker of high-fidelity truth is wise, he will consult one expert and no more. The more expert opinions he gets, the more confused he will become, because every expert opinion will be different from all other expert opinions. About the only thing that all high-fidelity experts agree about is that high fidelity is supposed to be realistic sound reproduction. They may even agree that Marantz amplifiers are pretty good and that Thorn's makes a passable turntable. But try to pin them down about pickups or other amplifiers or tuners or particularly loudspeakers, and one expert's preference is another one's anathema. Of course, any expert worth his salt can tell you why there's so much disagreement. The reason? Well, the other experts, although very nice guys, don't really know what they're talking about. Oh, they're pretty good technical men, mind you, but they don't really have the perceptive ear that's needed for a truly valid musical evaluation of reproduced sound. This is the crux of the matter. Measurements can help to describe a component's performance, but the final criterion for judging reproduced fidelity has always been the ear. And when we start to fall back on subjective judgments, we always end up with a diversity of opinions. A listener can train his ears to pick out all kinds of details in the reproduced sound, peaks, dips, phase shift, imbalance, and the like. But many such trained ears have never heard a live orchestra, so they're hardly qualified to tell you what is and what is not realistic. Also, if they've never heard a system with really low distortion or really smooth response, which many experts have not, they will be oblivious to small amounts of muddiness or roughness that will be quite evident to someone who is accustomed.
Again, which is the absolute sound? Which is the real Gordon Holt? The answer is none of them, because all those microphones, and they're all professional microphones, they're not, they're all high quality mics. Nevertheless, they all have a character, they all introduce their own coloration. So when you make a recording, choice of microphone has a huge effect on what goes onto the tape or the hard drive, and how you use those mics has a big effect. And then, what if there isn't a real musical event at all? Our next example I'll play you is something I did 2004. I was recording Countess, doing a Christmas album, and they had an arrangement of Deck the Halls, which they wanted choir and drums, and it was in that very reverberant hall that I made the other recording I played you, Souter Hall in Goshen, Indiana. Beautiful hall, but a lot of reverb. This was the result. drums in a reverberant space, they can't play fast because otherwise the sound builds up in the hall and just turns into mud. So you have there a wimpy, slow performance, which was not worth putting out. So we went into a studio in Minneapolis and produced a studio recording, this time without drums, but with shakers and other percussion instruments.
Technique on that last one?
That's a mix of cardioids and omnids, like it was in the Goshen recording. But if you can hear it, it's clean and clear and dry. But if that recording was a woman taking her clothes off, she would be naked. She wouldn't be nude. It's not very pretty. So Eric Blake, the producer of these recordings, who's now a Stereophile reviewer, said, well, it needs something. He didn't say more cowbell. He said, what if you take the drums from the Goshen recording, the very ambient recording, and add those to the dry voices? Wouldn't that work? And I said, I don't know how to do that. I don't have a recording of drums in the reverberant space where the singers aren't singing. So I can't just mix the drums in. So he said, well, is there anywhere the drums are playing by themselves? And I went through all the recordings, all the takes. I found 2 measures where there were just drums playing on their own. So this is what I had. So he said, well, can you loop that? Okay, I'll speed it up to match the new tempo, and I'll loop it to create a drum track. It was still pretty wimpy. So I tend to record all kinds of things over the years. So I recorded my late brother-in-law back in 1996. He had a new set of drums. So I recorded him in this church in Albuquerque, just basically doing samples. So I took the kick drum that my brother-in-law had recorded, and every time the kick drum occurs on that drum loop, I actually added the Albuquerque kick drum, which had much more depth and impact. So I added that to the voices. Fortunately, I had a drum entry. So I started off with that, and it still was missing something. It actually sounded okay. Now you're beginning to get towards a recorded performance. And so Eric said, well, can you lay down a bass line on it? Well, okay. It's going to be difficult because even though they're a very good choir, they start off in really good, perfect G-flat pitch, and by the end of the song, 4 minutes later, they've drifted down a little bit. So I laid down a bass line. I was having to retune my bass every 8 measures or so to match it to the tuning of the choir. And so this was the backing track I ended up with. It's drum loop from that 1 measure. There was another measure where I added in at random intervals to make it sound like there was a real drummer playing. And I added that little intro, and I added my bass guitar and got this. Now I have a backing track, and I added it to the vocals and got the final mix. One point, I won't play it again, but in the original take, the tenors come in, la, 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 and I thought that builds up a bit quickly. So what I did was put a measure of the drum loop bass track in between each of the tenor entries, just to stretch out the beginning a bit, with the producer's permission. So, this was the final mix. This is what came out of the CD, and everybody seemed very happy with there was an original acoustic event. In fact, there were two. There was the drums in the hall and the voices in the studio, but neither of those would make it on the record. So we created something which never existed, using bits and pieces from musicians. The drummer and I had never played together in the same hall, and in any case, he had never played that particular drum track. And the point is, there's no absolute sound, and 99.9% of recordings that you play on your systems are made like this. They are not purist recordings of original events. They are completely artificial constructs, which create between your ears, in your head, the illusion that there is a musical event. So how do you use that to judge the quality of loudspeakers or an amplifier or a CD player or whatever, when the microphones are colored, the mic techniques change the picture, and it's all artifice anyway? Well, what you don't do is sit down and compare the sound of what you're hearing to the absolute sound of a live event in real acoustic space, because it's not on the recorded. Not really. Even when, like with the Maura Bosch track, I was trying to get it there. So you play a recording, and it's like, it goes like that Electro Voice mic that Rush Limbaugh is so fond of. Oh, not any fans here? Anyway, and okay, you don't know if it's the recording, and you don't know if it's the loudspeaker. So you pick a different recording, and you play that. And if the coloration disappears, well, you know it was on the recording. But if the more recordings you play, the more things stay the same, the more the coloration stays the same. If the bass is always booming, if there's always a coloration, now, without any reference to the absolute sound, sorry to keep using that phrase, but it's very catchy, you now know that there's something wrong with that loudspeaker. Maybe it doesn't matter, maybe it does. But now, without any reference to the real thing, you've got a handle on the quality of what's going on. And that's the point of this little talk, which is forget philosophical ideals. Just listen. And listen to your own favorite recordings, not audiophile recordings, not recordings which people say, well, these are ones you must listen to. It's your recordings, and the important thing is when you go around shows like this, when you're at home, when you're at retailers, listen to as many different recordings as you can. Then you get a handle on what's going on. I'll finish by playing one more of my recordings. This is from 1984. It's an analog original. The late Peter Walker, founder of Quad, played flute in an amateur orchestra. And he asked me if I would record a performance his orchestra was giving of Elgar's massive Dream of Gerontius. It's a 200-piece choir, huge orchestra, 3 soloists, and it was going to be in Ely Cathedral, which is one of the most beautiful performing spaces you can imagine. So I checked out the cathedral, worked out where to put my mics. It's a Cowrex Soundfield mic, single point pickup, very purist, and I was going to hang it across the nave from ropes. So turn up for the rehearsal before the performance, and the dean of the cathedral says, you can't hang any mics. In fact, I don't want you, if you're going to make a recording, I don't want you to use any mics at all because they get in the way. People can see them. It upsets people. So I thought, what do I do now? So I did have a tall mic stand in my car. So I put this 12-foot high stand, the mic on a 12-foot high stand immediately above the conductor's head. So now think about the picture that's going to create. The soloists are to the sides. The orchestra is immediately in front and below, and the choir is at the back of the cathedral up there. And I thought, all I can do is press record and pray. So this is the result. This is the end of the first part of Gerontius, recorded in that manner. And it's, this time there's no artifice, it's just what the mic captured.
Oh
just tell you what the system you've been listening to. All the music you've been listening to is AIF files on my MacBook Pro. They're stored in my iTunes library, but I'm playing them back using pure music. Back, I'm either the computer. The USB output is feeding the Halide HD DAC that I reviewed a few months ago. True asynchronous 24-bit DAC. That's feeding this Lindemann integrated amp. Nordos Heimdall cables connecting it to the duet speakers and Wilson duet speakers, and there's these quantum boxes which I have no idea what they do, except if you take them out of the room the sound gets worse. So that's it. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Have a great show. And remember, there's no absolute sound, just music.